Good afternoon, everyone. This is Eva Klein from the ABA Center on Children and the Law. I want to thank you for joining this afternoon. As you are probably aware, this is the third of our webinars on domestic child sex trafficking that is being hosted by the Department of Children and Families, Division of Public Defender Services, and the Connecticut Heart Program, and the ABA Center on Children and the Law. And this particular webinar today is going to look at judicial responses to domestic child sex trafficking. We are going to have we're going to be joined by Afua Auto from the Center for Court Innovation, and she is the manager of Gender and Justice Initiatives, and she's going to be talking to us about some human trafficking court programs. But before we start, I just wanted to sort of welcome you to the Adobe Connect platform. Some of you may have used it before, but just want to make sure that you know that you can ask questions at any time during the session, and you can just type them right into the chat, which at the moment is at the bottom of the screen. It does move around sometimes. But at the bottom of the screen, then, if I could please ask you to type in what your role in the court system is, just so that we have a sense of who has joined us, and you know, if we should sort of gear our remarks to a particular type of professional. So if you're a judge or a specific type of attorney, child welfare, juvenile defender, what have you, or another court or legal professional, if you wouldn't mind just typing it right into the chat at the bottom, be very much appreciated. Wonderful, thank you. And if there's anybody on the phone who has not been able to join online, if you want to chime in as well, please feel absolutely free to do so. You can ask questions either over the phone or in the chat as we go through today's session. I do want to remind you that you should call in with of course you can't hear me if you're not already on the line, so I put it in the chat as well, but do want you to call in using the conference line as opposed to your computer. And also, we do not mute the phone lines so that people can interact and talk and participate. So if you are only listening, if you wouldn't mind muting your phone with whatever mechanism you have, or with *6 when you're not speaking, that would be greatly appreciated as well. Great. Well, thank you so much for putting that into the chat. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I was going to take a few minutes before Afua is able to join us in order to talk a little bit about some of the background of domestic child sex trafficking, just very just on background until we get into some of the specifics, and then some of the risk factors and some of the information specifically about Connecticut and what your youth look like, and what puts them at risk as well. So just because this is a session on sex trafficking, I wanted to put the definition up there so that we all have a common starting point, and that's the definition of severe form of sex trafficking from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that's, as you see there, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, and so forth of a person for a commercial sex act. And then if the person is induced to perform the sex act, the commercial sex act, and is not yet 18 years of age, that is what makes it a severe form of sex trafficking. So basically any child under the age of 18 who is engaged in a commercial sex act is a victim of trafficking. And of course, a commercial sex act is defined as any sex act for which anything of value is either given to or received by any person. So I want to talk a little bit about the vulnerability of runaway youth and youth missing from care. So we do know that there are certain risk factors for youth who are at risk of entering sex trafficking, and that includes being runaway youth or missing from care, being somehow previously involved in the foster care system. So here you can see that 1 out of every 6 runaways is likely a victim of sex trafficking, and that's according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We know that child abuse is a common characteristic of youth who have been sex trafficked. And we know that between 11 and 30% of youth who age out of foster care become homeless after they transition. And a good number of those also face unstable housing. So they might not be completely homeless, but they do face some issues in the stability of their housing, whether it's that, they stay with friends or for an extended period of time, but then might have to leave that situation as well, or circumstances change, so forth. They lose the ability to pay for an apartment, are not able to find employment, and so forth. And so for youth who are, so overall, adolescents, only 4% of all adolescents exchange sex for money. However, 28% of those who live on the street, or 10% of those in shelters, do engage in survival sex, and that is engaging in sex acts for food, shelter, or money. So really is a commercial sex act as defined before. And we know from various studies that have been done, one in Las Vegas where a shelter for youth found that 71% of sex trafficking survivors had been sexually abused. So again, that links back to previous child abuse being a common characteristic of youth who have been sex trafficked. And then in New York as well, there was a provider of services to homeless youth found that about 25% had been sex trafficked or engaged in survival sex. And of those, 48% said that they did that because they didn't have a safe place to stay. So clearly, being a runaway youth or missing from care or having left care shows, places youth at risk for sex trafficking. So we have been joined by Afua, and I do want to welcome her as a presenter. So Afua, have you been able to join on the line as well?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Great. So absolutely. So, and the reason I wanted to do a special welcome at this point is because my next slide talks about a study that was actually done by the Center for Court Innovation, and it was a national study about youth involvement in the sex trade. And it was really interesting because, well, to me at least, hopefully you will find it so as well, because it found that the average age when youth first traded sex for something of value was 15.8 years old, or I should say either became, traded sex through survival sex or were trafficked by someone else. And that was at 15.8 years old. So that's a little bit older than previous estimates had shown, but it still is quite young and really at a vulnerable time in these youth's lives. It also found that the youth were disproportionately Black or African American. They were 70% of the interview subjects. Also, they found that arrests for prostitution were low. So a lot of federal legislation, other legislation, I know on the state level, a lot of the advocacy efforts are really trying to move the needle on the recognition that victims of sex trafficking are victims and not offenders, and that they should not be arrested. Back in 2009, there were a little over 1,000 arrests of juveniles for prostitution, and Now they estimate around just over 700 per year, according to FBI statistics. And so 700 is still too many, but it does seem to have come down somewhat. But still, that doesn't really necessarily hit the exact problem, because while in this study only 16% were arrested for prostitution, 65% had been arrested for other offenses, including petty larceny, shoplifting, drug-related offenses, just really more collateral issues or issues that still brought them into the justice system, but were not specific to prostitution. Even though they may have been involved in, if they were sex trafficked, they were not necessarily arrested for prostitution, but really for these other offenses. And I know from decades past, there was often a view in law enforcement that arresting youth who were being trafficked was a way to bring them into the system and get them resources. And now, that is changing, but still they're being involved in the justice system, which has serious implications for them as they go through their lives and try to establish themselves as young adults and onward. So some of the other characteristics and needs, of course, childhood trauma is a common characteristic, previous abuse and so forth. And then the needs that youth identified as the top three for what they needed in order to help establish themselves and get out of the sex trafficking situations that they found themselves in were that they needed housing and utilities, or funding, money, some way of acquiring housing and paying their bills, employment, education, and they just needed food and money. So very, very basic needs that they placed over the need for counseling that may have been identified by some of the professionals that were working with them as a result of their having been sex trafficked. So really shows that the youth are focused on their basic needs and just getting through daily and meeting those needs, and sometimes that is how they become vulnerable to sex traffickers. So that was the Center for Court Innovation study, and I did want to talk a little bit about youth in Connecticut, especially the homeless youth and youth who have run away. So the 2018 Youth Outreach and Count was conducted January 23rd on a specific night, point in time count, and found that there were just over 5,000 youth under age 25 who reported being homeless or unstably housed. And that included 254 who were literally homeless, just had absolutely no place to stay. And then of those, 1/3 of the homeless and unstably housed youth indicated that they had somehow been involved with the Department of Children and Families, have been placed in foster care. And then those who had been placed in foster care, 42 responded that they were still in foster care. So, there still is that population of youth who are vulnerable and on the street and vulnerable to sex trafficking who have come from the foster care system. So of those, there's a percentage of youth who were at some point encouraged or pressured into an exchange of sexual acts for money or drugs, what we call survival sex. And it was slightly higher for youth older than 18 at 14%, but it was still significant at 11% for youth who were under 18. And then those who answered that yes, they were subject to that coercion or pressure, 21%, both, across all the age ranges, said they were currently in that coercive sexual situation. So clearly it's still an issue and something that hopefully with some of the court processes and some of the approaches that are being implemented and can be implemented can reach this population in a better way. so that was just sort of to give you some background, and now I want to hand it over to Afua Audu, and as I mentioned, she's the manager of Gender and Justice Initiatives for the Center for Court Innovation. So Afua, I will hand it over to you, and
awesome.
Just want to let you know that you can move your slides with the arrows at the bottom.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Fantastic. Yeah.
I actually was taking notes while you were talking because of the information out of Connecticut. I think I am not alone when you see that data scaled down to a particular state or one area, that it becomes even more alarming. And I think those low numbers, like 21%, 14%, sometimes look, like decent indicators. But I think any time we see our young people in any issues or having any concerns, we want to enact and find a reason why and explain it. So I'm not going to explain it, but just kind of give some context for some of the information that you just reviewed relative to CCI's National Comprehensive Study regarding the needs of youth, trafficked youth, and traumatized youth. And so I always often start with these examples and understanding that trauma as experienced by individuals is experienced on an interpersonal, a systemic, and structural level, right? And that these impact our identities and our social engagements and experiences. The structure that we're born into, right? The race we are labeled under, the gender, the sexuality, that over time, relative to society, that can shift. However, it's important to flesh this out because young people know this. Anytime you sit down with a young person who has survived, they will reference their race, their culture, their gender, their sexuality, their economics, their location, their demography, basically, as to why they are oftentimes in the situations that they're in, or why they've experienced the outcomes that they've experienced in the criminal legal system or in foster care or in school. And so often I find as adults or as providers, as system stakeholders, we can be remiss in realizing that trauma is experienced on both an interpersonal level, and it can be a one-time event, and it can also be a chronic experience whereby individuals return home or to a relationship or to a dynamic that is chronically abusive. And that quite often in many runaways' lives, they are experiencing chronic acute trauma on a consistent basis. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that means for their development in a minute. But I did want to talk about how society also plays a role into the growth and development of our young people, what they're seeing and what they're up against. And so the team over at Occultamen does a great job with this slide, and I'll definitely be crediting the agencies and organizations that skirt this work. But again, for young people who are, very aware and very awake, very in tune with, and I think more so than even my generation, very in tune with modern shifts in identity, the ways in which they can open. I think in a recent study out of the Pew Research Center found that almost 50% of youth today, that's individuals under 18 years old, don't identify as straight or heterosexual or heteronormative. So it is important to acknowledge, to understand that their own identities are shifting and the language that they use is shifting, but oftentimes the responses to that shift has not occurred overall. And this greatly impacts, right, the experiences of growing, developing adolescents and teenagers. I think one of the most debilitating dynamics in our society is the gender binary, that boys and girls are forced to make a decision about how they will show up in their gender roles in order to avoid things like bullying or ostracization in their families. And so they learn very early on boys in particular learn very early on to separate out their behaviors away from things that behaviors that look like feminine behaviors, so as not to be considered feminine. But that oftentimes there are young people, as we see more and more, becoming a little bit more comfortable in their truth, finding allies and support. And so I break this down as well because we often think about these basic needs of young people, but another need is this sense of normalcy, this sense of belonging, this sense of acceptance, and that a good amount of young people are not feeling accepted in their homes, primarily because they are not fitting into traditional patriarchal expectations of their identity. Quite simply, I explain to people that gender is what we go to sleep as, and sexuality is who we go to sleep with, and none of it is any of our business. However, we want to know. And oftentimes the ways in which we want information, the ways in which we yield knowledge can mean many things. Oftentimes for trauma survivors of color, it can mean that your trauma reactions or the ways that you are coping with that trauma are pathologized, mischaracterized, or stereotyped. And so I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself in talking about trauma reactions, but coming all the way back to the role of gender and sexuality, again, whereby youth who are trafficked are concerned. Oftentimes, young people are not trafficked relative to their gender and sexuality. What do I mean by that? Sometimes young people present, very young girls, for instance, may present very androgynous. And so on the underground market, on the sex trade market, they would be marketed as maybe even a trans androgynous gender non-binary product. And the same goes when the pendulum swings in the opposite direction, that young women that are pregnant are incredibly vulnerable, that girls of size are vulnerable to certain markets. But that young people who themselves identify as maybe bisexual, polyamorous, or gay, or might be marketed on the sex trade as something other than their sexual identity. And this can be complicating for law enforcement. This can be complicated for prosecutorial staff when individuals disclose gender violence, such as rape and sexual assault or menacing, that it does not align with our ideas of gender and sexuality so far as tradition goes. I could talk about that forever, but I'm going to jump ahead and kind of leave that a little open in case there are some questions following. When I talk often about trauma, I describe it as a force, and I'm very excited to start just talking about it as this thing that goes back and forth between people and between organizations or industries, and I have to slow myself down and explain that trauma is not one thing. It's not the car accident. It's not the gunshot. It is actually the result from an event or a series of events. Or it can be that one event, but all the things that encompass it, right? And how it is experienced by an individual or community, as whether it's physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, it has lasting adverse effects on the individual and or their communities, on your functioning, on your resilience building, on your social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Interestingly, trauma can be experienced by two people going through the exact same thing, but your trauma reactions are as unique as your fingerprint, as your thumbprint. We can be sitting side by side in a car and experience something tumultuous and traumatic. And years down the line, individual sitting next to me would recount that story very differently. This is because your trauma experiences have everything to do with who you are right up until that point. The soft place you had to land in your life, who raised you, who supported you, how you recovered from things in the past. It's also important to note that there is, again, right, it's coming up again here, that there is a micro experience of trauma, that interpersonal, child abuse. According to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study out of Kaiser Permanente, there are a few indicators for interpersonal trauma: separation from a parent, extreme substance use in the home. Why? Because trauma is not just what happens to me. Vicarious trauma is just as debilitating as interpersonal trauma, personal trauma. And so if I am aware that someone I love, and think about this in the context of a child who love very deeply, right? Who can't discern between love and like, and passion, right? And so for children who love their authority figure or their guardian or their sibling very deeply, to know that that person has experienced trauma, once you become aware that that loved one has experienced it, it is as though you have experienced it yourself. This is particularly important whereas we can consider community violence. Hyper-violent communities, hyper-policed, hyper-surveillance areas, right? And what happens when there's an inability to mourn those who are lost, neighbors and fellow citizens or colleagues or classmates. And so again, there is that micro impact of trauma and that macro. I just mentioned classmates or friends, right, in school who might have been hurt or harmed or murdered. And then being in a school system, there it is, a systemic trauma that marginalizes you based on the color of your skin, on your size, on your zip code, on your economic situation, right? And so that systemic trauma and oppression conflates the micro trauma experiences. I'm going to speed along because I know I think I have 1 minute left, but real quick I want to share. Components of trauma are simple. The event happens, the experience is subjective, and the impact, as I just mentioned, is relative to your own experience and identity. It is as unique, again, as the fingerprint. And the reason I share this brain little tidbit is because we've all heard these references about of course, fight, flight, and freeze, and what happens to the body and when it needs to protect itself in the middle of a traumatic stimulus. But the other thing that's important to note is that area that's circled at the base of the brain is where the amygdala is located, the medulla amygdala, right? The central nervous system of the entire body. An interesting thing happens when it's stimulated by trauma. It expands a little bit. That gland expands just a little bit to release adrenaline and norepinephrine and epinephrine so that it regulates things like your breathing and your heart rate and your body temperature. But it also helps you do things like remember key components, that natural human instinct. So it's what keeps you from running into fire or running out into traffic. Or maybe you run into traffic, but you're able to avoid a few cars, right? That's the ability of your brain to keep itself alive. When that gland expands, once that trauma happens, it never retracts to the original size. This is important to keep in mind when we talk about young people. Because we then expect the insipid we, right, universal we, expect young people to return to school, right, and sit still in their seats after a traumatic experience, or to be able to answer a judge looking them in the eye with a straight sentence after they've experienced maybe the trauma of walking back into a courtroom or riding the paddy wagon from jail to court or being arrested at all, right? Once the handcuffs come out, we talk about the level of trauma that incites. And so that amygdala will expand relative to all trauma. And again, in very small exponentially incremental small ways. But it never retracts. It never returns to its normal size. And so many individuals' coping mechanisms and responses to this, I'm so sorry that this is hard to see. I think that was just a quick glitch there but I'll go back and share that I mentioned there are 3 components to trauma. There are also 3 primary responses, human bodily responses to trauma. The first you saw on the brain, right, where the brain shuts down, the sensory deficits kick in. That's when the adrenaline starts to be released. The secondary impacts and effects of trauma are how the human body and the human soul soothe itself after the trauma has occurred. And so I'm so sorry that you can't see this slide. I will try to make it available. I believe it's available at the Center for Court Innovation website, information on justice-involved women and human trafficking. However, the secondary effects of trauma can also be found in something like the DSM-5, the statistical manual, diagnostic and statistical manual on mental wellness, because oftentimes individuals will engage in substance use, in behaviors that often are referred to as antisocial behaviors. Those, however, are noted as secondary trauma responses, Well, those trauma responses are now conflated by that macro trauma experience, right? The structures that someone has been born into, their race, their gender, their class, their demography. Another interesting thing about these trauma reactions is that they also are misdemeanor crimes in many jurisdictions, and in some jurisdictions, felonious crimes. And so it can be very difficult to look at a shoplifting defendant and consider their trauma schema, because shoplifting is a usual petty offense. However, shoplifting is oftentimes linked to extreme abandonment and separation, and as well as substance use and abuse. According to the ACE study, about 89% of adults who engage in what they call self-harming behaviors, substance use, alcohol, self-harm, suicide ideology, and so on and so forth, and extreme depression and anxiety, had experienced at least 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And so it's interesting in that a lot of recovery efforts, rehabilitation efforts, focus on sobriety or changing behaviors, and very few focus on tackling and unpacking and undoing much of that childhood trauma. I'm almost done, folks, but I appreciate you all listening. Here is just a quick rundown on that Kaiser study I mentioned, if you are interested in taking a look or sharing it with some of your colleagues. And here's another one of my slides that's against the lighter backdrop. I wanted to share a little bit about the culture of shame, the secrecy, and the culture of silence in many communities driven by shame. This comes to mind when we talk about the disproportionate numbers of Black and African American children that are runaways and that end up engaged and vulnerable, to domestic sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. In many of these communities, particularly the Black community in the United States, the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, and the community's relationship with law enforcement out of these systems have resulted in a significant choice that many of these communities have had to make. Relative to how patriarchy plays out in this country, men then, right, are valued over the experiences of girls and women. In an effort to maintain safety and save face for the community as well, women and girls, and oftentimes in these communities, have been encouraged to remain silent about the assaults visited on them. And so quite almost naturally, in an abusive relationship, secrecy is required, right? A significant amount of codependency on the abuser is required in order for the ruse to continue. And the shame associated with gender violence, with sexual violence, with bodily harm, particularly for young boys, results in silence. And so in our studies show us that almost, I think, 1 in 4, almost 2 in 4 women will experience sexual assault by their 21st birthday. And that number goes up about 45 to 50% for women and girls of color, and even more so when they are impoverished. And not because poverty results in more dangerous exposure, but it does result in less access to support services and alternatives to these life experiences. And so the secrecy, shame, and silence, this culture of silence, is one of the reasons, one of the ways in which trafficking and gender-based violence against youth as young as we see now on average about 15 years old, is so prevalent. I think I wanted to share this as well. This comes from Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, GEMS. It's a great continuum highlighting many of the contributing attributes to victimization, to vulnerability of victimization, an inability to separate out love, sex, and abuse. This is particularly true for children who experience sexual violation in their early formative years, It's very difficult for them to trust adults, to see them as anything other. And that trickles into their adolescence. The violation of boundaries. It can be difficult once their boundaries have been violated and crossed. It will be difficult for them to harness and respect others' boundaries. Again, that guilt and shame is carried over. It's important to note that girls and boys, when I talked about that gender binary and how they're forced to make a decision, by the time they reach puberty, that decision is really relative to sexual objectification in society. And so girls, quite early, actually, before even that age 13, we're seeing girls in studies as young as 9 and 5 looking for the attention of boys and men to validate their identity and existence. Again, I'm not sharing anything new, but when you conflate this with personal trauma by an adult, by a guardian or an authority figure, as well as those macro traumatic schema, that it can be quite difficult to expect recovery and rehabilitation from a young person. And so what we've looked for in our coordinated community responses is kind of founding ourselves on the guiding principles of trauma-informed care, and understanding that healing happens in relationship, and that relationship is one of the trauma schema that has been interrupted, right? In a traumatic experience of interpersonal violence, the relationship is almost instantaneously disrupted. And so by just acknowledging that trauma exists and that it has significant impact on growth and development, places one miles ahead on the road to recovery. Of course, in our workspaces and in our court areas, promoting safety is essential, and that is necessary through training, earning trust. Similarly, adjusting the client-attorney relationship. Judges in many of these specialty courts work to adjust the judge-client relationship as well as a way to harness trust from individuals who trust no one. And providing holistic care is more so about centering the voices of these survivors, and instead of relegating them to one program, considering that many programs might have various strengths that can support one client or a few clients. And so we use the Human Trafficking Intervention Court model and their service provider task force model to drive more holistic responses to traumatized youth. Respecting human rights is important because for many of our foreign nationals, many of our immigrants, human rights and the concept of human rights has very rarely ever been addressed. And so centering that in the ethos or the mission or the values of an agency organization right away indicates to those individuals for whom accessing human rights is also foreign, that they have a voice and that they will be centered in their care and in their treatment and recovery. And of course, believing the narrative, I have to share this last, and I know I'm rushing, but oftentimes women and women of color in particularly are not believed simply by just opening their mouths and saying what they have. The benefit of the doubt rests heavy on these women and these populations. And so we encourage belief, oftentimes asking stakeholders to read rap sheets and criminal records last, right? Obtaining the story from the individual. And in many of those secondary cases, those shoplifting, assault cases, petty larceny cases that have nothing to do with trafficking, that by believing the narrative and centering those voices, earning trust early on in an assessment, oftentimes will reveal a trafficking dynamic in that individual's life by way of where they're living, how they're moving around an area. Are they being shuttled around? Do they have access to their own money? How much of their money do they have access to? And then again, who are they taking care of? Sometimes young women and boys that are being trafficked are given the responsibility of taking care of children within a stable, children that have been sired by either a trafficker and the trafficked, or a John and a victim or a survivor. Lastly, I think what's really challenging at times is sharing power. This challenges us as individuals. our bias against the indigent, right, in this country, individuals who don't look like us, individuals who don't speak our language, those who have sexual identities that we can't readily identify, placing them and rather more so, I would describe it as stepping aside at the podium and sharing the microphone with individuals. This has worked to inform that trafficking court model. And so clients are asked not only what needs do they have that have not been met, but also what other systems are they involved in? Quite often they're involved in child protective services, housing court, traffic court. And so we use that other engagement to leverage their time and their energy, right, so that we don't overextend someone's experience in the legal system. And finally, you can't do this all without communicating with compassion. And I want to stress compassion for ourselves, because when we learn that we've been talking differently to people who are darker, or talking differently to people who are of size, or shifting our gaze when certain individuals walk through the door, once we learn that, we can shift our behaviors. We can change the ways we engage these individuals. But we also have to have some compassion for the fact that we were doing it a different way, dare I say wrong, but maybe even traditionally, and that those traditions served a decent purpose at some time, but that time has shifted. And so I think my time is up. Again, I appreciate being able to chat with you all, but I'm going to hand this back over so I won't ramble on.
Oh, no, thank you so much. That was excellent, and I appreciate it, especially towards the end when you were talking a little bit more about the human trafficking court model. So I'm going to open it up to questions from our participants, but while people maybe formulate some questions they might have either to ask over the phone or to type in the chat box, I was just going to ask if you could maybe talk a little bit about that model, a little bit more than you already have. And particularly, it was interesting to me how you mentioned that the judge-client relationship shifts and, how that's accomplished. And since we primarily have public defenders and assigned counsel on the line, just sort of what an attorney's role in that might be to help with that shift, or how that affects their client's case.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. The trauma-informed lawyering is an article, I believe, that can be Googled in Scholar and is referenced often by my colleagues and I. I'm sorry, I just don't have that reference in front of me, but I do want to share that. We talked first about adjusting the client-attorney relationship, client-judge relationship, because of the nature of engaging trauma survivors, right? And so one of the, I won't say complaints, but significant feedback I received from attorneys that I've worked with over the years is how to manage all of the information that they receive, as well as managing not being mandated with reporters and having very sensitive information about their clients. And so we've had to work very strategically. And I would say that we all had very shared values that here, or at least in my experience, we were working with a dedicated team of attorneys to trafficking. And so we didn't have to twist any arms to kind of explain why the rush to calling Child Protective Services might have to hold off for a second while we gather some more information. But also, these attorneys recognize their important role as confidential agents and as task force members among the court model. So here in the 5 boroughs, we have 4 trafficking courts and 1 human trafficking service provider task force. That is made up of about 10, I would say, with about 12, 2 dangling agencies, but about 10 agencies and their human trafficking specific representatives. And so some agencies are human trafficking specific. Some agencies are quite larger and have an arm or wing division dedicated to trafficking. We meet quarterly, and then often in many of the courts, because they're actually present in the courtroom weekly, they then see each other on a consistent basis. Because we have a few more resources, but not many resources specific to trafficked folk, these attorneys are welcome to join the task force meetings at any time, but also have direct access to us at any time because we kind of travel as a cohort from court to court to court. So in the Bronx, there's one trafficking team, but they're all part of the trafficking division at Legal Aid throughout the city. And so they meet together. They are abreast and apprised of shifts and changes on their end, as well as the providers. And then we all come together and keep each other apprised of anything that's occurring in the courts, directly with the mechanics, with court officers, any issues we're having gaining access to our clients if they have been incarcerated or confined are discussed. And then we talk about how to best fill in gaps for clients as providers. What agencies have fallen off, what agencies can provide what services, and how to supplement those with other services and programming. And so that's been primarily my own role, working for the Center for Court Innovation, which is a nonprofit here. I work ancillary to these legal stakeholders, so they don't have to carry the burden of assembling this task force. But in recent months, I've had to delegate some responsibilities, and some of the other agencies that have a little bit more time. The arrest for misdemeanor prostitution charges here in New York has dropped so much that we have a little bit more space in some of our agencies to pay attention to some of these other issues, like filling in service provider gaps. I think I answered your question. I hope I did. Let me let someone else ask the question.
Yes, thank you. Is there anyone else who has a question for Afua? And again, you're welcome to speak up on the phone or just type it into the chat. Okay. Oh, somebody is typing, so we'll just hold off 1 second. I think the chat function is great. Sometimes it's just easier to say the question out loud, but feel free to type in.
Absolutely.
Or speak up.
Did you talk a little bit about the fact that juveniles appearing in family court, maybe even at risk for trafficking?
Right. Yes. So,
okay.
Actually, I mentioned it in terms of youth who are missing from care, runaway or missing from care. Of course, there are youth who are also at risk for trafficking while they're in their placement. That's definitely true. So that does occur as well. So I think that just some of the characteristics or some of the ACEs and other things that make youth vulnerable within the system, and when they leave the system, either transition out or leave on their own accord. So there are a couple questions now in the chat, and the one is, how much legal support that you know of is there for the indigenous youth population?
Wow, good question. There is actually a good amount of legal support. What we don't have is law enforcement response / support for indigenous youth. And what I mean by that is the inability to train law enforcement on federal property, federal land, mandated land, in response to gender-based violence and trafficking. And so good colleagues of mine up in Minnesota, oh my goodness, I'm trying to remember the name, Women's and Sexual Assault Council in northern Minnesota has been organizing national advocacy efforts to support youth that are trafficked. And there are actually some other initiatives coming out of the Move to End Violence cohort around generating more legal support for Indigenous youth nationwide, right? So that there's a cadre of attorneys that can be dispatched from one area to another. And I think that actually started out of Manitoba, Canada. I want to say we could probably look that up, but yeah, northern Minnesota. Oh, I'm gonna find the name of their organization. I know Nicole Matthews is the executive director there, and has been leading some efforts in that direction. I see that next question. Wondering if any thoughts on how, if at all, we can legislate some of the best practices that you've referred to here, particularly related to the provision of trauma from legal. That would be awesome. I actually have skirted that topic with some of the judges I've worked with, because, and particularly actually, this is really interesting. Male judges have approached me about this. There are some men judges up in North New York that have worked to strategically make their courtroom trauma informed, and I'm not taking the credit for that. I'm going to credit my predecessor and my entire team with supporting these different delegations. But some of these men don't sit higher above their defendants. They actually have their proceedings occur at a table. Some of them don't meet in court at all. Some of these proceedings occur in chambers, so women and victims feel a little bit more safe. The court officers have stepped up, and right now this training is required for all court officers in New York State, and I'm hoping to expand that to New Jersey and Connecticut, actually. But I would love to see some legislation around trauma-informed legal response. Right now we're piloting something here in Brooklyn, and it's slow to roll because law enforcement is probably the last entity that wants to consider a trauma-informed anything. But I'm not losing hope. And I appreciate that question, and thank you so much for that. I'm going to write that down for my own personal goal, actually.
Yeah, and I can just add a little bit on that in terms of, it's not legislation, but the National Council for Juvenile Family Court Judges, of course, is very involved in, they're doing assessments of courts, juvenile courts, trauma assessments. I think they call them trauma audits. So they have a whole program where they're looking at the courts and how trauma responsive they are. And both the NCJ, FCJ, and the American Bar Association, of course, where I work, we have policies about that have passed our governing body about trauma-informed legal advocacy. And in some of the previous webinars, and I can add them to the resources here as well, we've shared not only the policy but also some information about how to approach legal practice in a trauma-informed way. So it's a great it's a great question in terms of whether it can be legislated, but certainly there are practices out there that are being promulgated and just we're trying to spread, and I'm sure CCI is as well, just trying to spread that throughout the field. So it is definitely something to think about in terms of how to make it more permanent, to actually establish those practices. Okay, are there any other questions? So this has been excellent, and thank you for the questions and the participation as well, and for all the information that you have shared. And I was planning to talk. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And if anybody continues to have any questions while I'm sort of discussing these last few things and wrapping up, please feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll still try to answer them before our hour is up. But I did just want to, I had planned to talk a little bit about some of the resources that you see at the bottom right-hand corner. All of those are available there for your download. And they discuss various issues that are court-related. For instance, there's a issue brief on the role of the court in implementation of the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Estranging Families Act, and as well the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges and NCMEC put out a publication on what steps a judge can take when a child runs away or goes missing from care. So these are specific to judges, ideas that recommendations that they could do as part of the response to the Preventing Sex Trafficking Act, and really try to put some of those practices in place. There were some questions that came out of the role of the court in implementing Estranging Families Act, and again, it's down in those resources. This is an example of some of those questions that you can find in that guide. Really, like, what efforts have been made to locate the youth? What was the placement prior to the Runaway episode? What services was the youth receiving? Part of the Preventing Sex Trafficking Act really requires a lot of data to go back from the states to the Department of Health and Human Services in trying to address the issue of sex trafficking, and really trying to find out more about what's causing you to run and what services are being provided. So these are questions that judges can ask. They're questions that you can also, in your practice, try to be mindful of within your caseload, and just really trying to get at those specific questions and ways to support clients. And the publication also includes some questions about when a youth returns. So, is the youth safe? Is there a need for protective orders to keep that youth safe now that he or she is back in care? Has there been any screening or assessment done? Has anybody debriefed the youth from within the Department of Children and Families or any other service agency? Have there been any changes to the placement, or do there need to be changes to the placement to try to prevent any future runaway episodes that put the child at risk? So I encourage you to look at all those resources and see if any of them are helpful to you or to any of the judges before whom you appear, and try to implement some of those recommendations in your own practice. So I am just going to move us here to our thank you page. Really appreciate your participation. I would very much appreciate if you could please fill out those 3 questions we have there on the left. And I do want to remind you that we will have our final webinar in the series in 2 weeks from today on September 25th at the same time. I am going to leave this page open for a while. Please feel free to come back and look at some of the judicial resources that are listed there. I will try to find, I'll check in with Afua and try to find that trauma-informed lawyering article and add that as well, and any other resources. So you can check back either later this afternoon or at a later date, and be sure to download any of those that you find might be helpful to you in your practice. So again, thank you all so much, and thank you, Afua. That was excellent, and really appreciate your time this afternoon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.